I know people, like I know people want to say about
C'est un événement qui est porté par plusieurs de nos partenaires importants. L'OPES, l'Observatoire pour l'éducation et la santé, qui est piloté par 𝗲𝗀𝗲𝗵𝗍𝗂, le Centre de recherche en santé publique, le CRESP, le 𝗲𝗲𝗴𝗀𝗇, et il y a aussi 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗍𝗍, l'Association québécoise des centres de la petite enfance. Donc nous remercions évidemment les organisateurs de nous donner cette occasion de jeter ce regard croisé sur le Québec et la Norvège. Alors, nous voulons dire une bienvenue, welcome to our guest, professeur Zachrisson, donc qui a fait le voyage, le déplacement depuis la Norvège pour cet événement. En Amérique du Nord, le Québec se distingue comme État, comme province, se distingue par ses politiques sociales. Un héritage de la Révolution tranquille que l'on a su faire fructifier. Il faut rappeler que les centres de la petite enfance, donc c'est une initiative récente que l'on a eue, qui a été portée en particulier par l'ancienne première ministre Pauline Marois. Mais en Europe, on cite souvent, et au Québec, on les cite aussi très souvent, ce qu'on appelle cet exceptionnalisme scandinave. Donc, des États-providence qui sont très généreux, des faibles inégalités, une grande solidarité, mais aussi une confiance sociale, une confiance des citoyens dans leurs institutions. Ce qui distingue aussi les pays scandinaves, c'est leur capacité à s'adapter en permanence, donc en misant eux aussi sur des révolutions, des petites révolutions tranquilles. Donc des démarches axées sur le consensus, des démarches axées sur le dialogue, plutôt que sur la confrontation. Cependant, ceci étant dit, je veux pas faire passer les pays scandinaves pour un bloc monolithique. Chacun de ces pays a ses propres réalités. Mais aujourd'hui, la loupe sera sur la Norvège et l'idée, c'est de voir au Québec qu'est-ce qu'on peut apprendre de leur expérience sur l'éducation préscolaire. Alors, je vais céder tout de suite la parole à nos conférenciers. Je vous souhaite une bonne écoute et une bonne participation à cet événement.
Merci beaucoup, Karl. Alors, mon nom est 𝗲𝗲𝗴𝗍𝗲𝗵𝗍𝗂, je suis professeure ici à l'École de santé publique, chercheur à l'hôpital Sainte-Justine, et je travaille sur le développement des enfants et les services publics qui peuvent au mieux les soutenir. This conference will be bilingual. I will speak in English for my conference, but Marie-France Reynaud, who will comment on the talks that Henrik and I give, will speak in French. And je sais qu'il y a des gens qui s'expriment seulement en anglais ici, donc ça va balancer. I would like to introduce Henrik Zachrisson, who is a professor at University of Oslo and researcher who is very special for from an American point of view, because he is very much involved in the politics of early education, but in a non-partisan way. Alors, this is a very important point. Maybe if we have the opportunity later, we can talk about the relationships between policy and research, policy and science in Norway as an example of a model that we could aspire to a little bit more. So I will give an introduction. Henrik will speak about the way things are organized in Norway, and Marie-France Reynaud will comment. We'll wrap up the talks. I wanted to have this event because of one main reason. We often end up conversations at dinners with friends saying, Scandinavian countries, we should be like Scandinavian countries. They have resolved many of the issues that we have here or that we see. And I wanted to go a little bit deeper in that. What is it that is done for things to work well on this specific topic of early childhood education? So, 3 key messages for my talk. First, the environments in which children grow up shape who they are. Genetics have a big role to play, but environments are really important. Second, once we've said that and we acknowledge that, what can we do to provide quality environments? And the third point is how to minimize social inequalities in early childhood, because that's where it all starts, and there is a lot of room for doing good. And doing harm also, that's why we need to be careful. So these are brain charts over the lifespan, and est-ce que c'est un pointeur? Est-ce que c'est pas un pointeur? No, okay. So we have age on the x-axis from birth to 100 years, and on the y-axis we have brain development. Now 𝗏𝗏 spouse is in the audience, so I have to be careful what I say, but this is really brain growth structurally. And the different parts of the brain that are growing at a fast, rapid pace before age 5. So this is to illustrate the magnitude of the development over the first 5 years of life. Then what we have is a process of connections of the neurons in the brain. Neurons are a little bit like the forest, but some connect, and then there's the pruning, a process called pruning, where connections also are removed or dissolved if they are not stimulated, or because of genetic drivers, genetic factors. But this is all going on at a particularly rapid pace during the first 5 years of life. And the process is particularly sensitive to environmental inputs, thus being careful about what we do and the quality of the environments that we provide. Then there is the notion that different parts of the brain connect themselves during this developmental period. So emotions linked to behavior and behavioral control, language, memory, all these parts are originally not connected very well. Therefore, when the toddler is having a temper tantrum, a big crisis, crying uncontrollably for seemingly no reason, it is not because he or she does not want to control himself. It's not that he doesn't have the will. He doesn't have the capacity yet. The brain is not ready for control. So knowing these things about child development may allow some empathy and some perhaps different approach to raising and educating children. Also, behavioral control is supported by the environment, very much so. As we know, modeling, seeing family members, adults behaving in ways that are pro-social and respectful leads to similar behaviors. This is a slide illustrating the ability of the brain to change over the life course, which is the blue line, and the reverse, the amount of efforts required to change as we become older. And so you have on the x-axis the age between 2 and 70. And as we see here, we have much more room for, I mean, it's easier to influence people to respond in some ways. Well, if you have a partner who is in this area, or even in this area, then you need to be very patient because room for change is very, very reduced. This is, so the brain data, the red line is brain development, and the black line is cumulative share of public spending. This is real data. I had this calculated by a friend, or colleague, economist. And my economist friends in the room, I invite you to comment if you want. But so what we see is that prior to age 5, the public investment is really not up to par with the brain development. So we can expect some of that, of course, because children are not sick. And we say they're not in school yet. But we can set up early education. That's what we will discuss today. The curve of what we do with our public money is the reverse of what is shown to be a good social investment by some economists. Okay, now, so once we've said that, what do we do? If we invest more money, what should it be? How should it be invested? This is why Henrik is here to tell us about how they do it in Norway. This is the GDP, proportion of GDP invested in early childhood education in Quebec versus Norway. So it's about close to 1.4 in Norway, and in Quebec it's below 1. It's about 0.69 if we take into account preschool, and lower if we don't. So that's one information about investment. Now, in Norway, and so Henrik, you can comment any time, of course, as we said. Basically, you are sure to have a space in early childhood education, and in fact, it's not daycare; it's early childhood education by teachers. So the number of space per 100 children is 95, and in Quebec it's 75. And those who do not use in Quebec are very different than those who use specifically on education, lower education, lower income, and lower work activity, plus de non-emploi. The other thing, what I want to draw your attention here to, starting at age 1-2 in Norway, almost 90% of children are in early care and education, while it's 73% in Quebec. So we get to 85-98% in Quebec, which is la maternelle grande section, 98%. But it takes a long time, and so we have many children in Quebec who do not receive early care and education, and they are typically more disadvantaged. Now, in terms of, we will dive into this a little bit more, but as an overview, what we see here is that the Norwegian system is both public and private. Henrik, do you wanna?
I can
chime in. Yeah.
So hi everyone. I will come a little bit back to this later on, but in Norway, it is a joint private-public system under public administration. So it's it works the way that parents select centers for their children, often not knowing whether they're private or public, because these centers are governed by the same regulations and funded with exactly the same amount of money from the public. So while the statistics here are accurate, there are 48% of centers in Norway are public, and remaining, well, about... Oh, we made an adjustment to the statistics. So it's 59% of the centers are public. 49% are public, 51% are private. The private are usually a little bit smaller, but they are essentially very, very similar, with staff to child ratio, requirements for education, etc., which I will return to.
Yeah.
So we can come back to that a little bit.
Yeah. The point here is, so parental care is very, very low in Norway, while it's 1/3 of children in Quebec. And then in Quebec, we have this private-public system, but the requirements are not the same for public and private. And so it is not a problem for a private center in a well-off neighborhood, but it is a problem for a private center in low-income neighborhood. And the Norwegian system, dual private-public works. So this is one part that we should look into, because it's close to what we have in Quebec. It's just not the same quality in the two systems. So the ratio of educator to children is different. 1 to 3, one teacher for 3 children in Norway, and then 1 to 6 after 3 years, while in Quebec we have 1 to 5, 1 to 8. So it's a very different daily activity for educators. Then the investment is different per child, per space. If I want, I will summarize the first row by saying that the investment in Norway is 3 times higher than that in Quebec for a space per child per year. The cost to parents is minimal and almost nothing for low-income families. And the ratio, the salary ratio, so how much educators or teachers are paid, is really important for having high-quality personnel taking care of the children, educating the children. And so the ratio here for an educator is 60 to 80% salary of a teacher, while it's 90% in Norway. The last point I want to make is the evidence that we have that early childcare and education, even in our context where it's at a level we would like it to be overall, the overall quality to be higher, especially in disadvantaged neighborhoods. But with what we have, we still achieve outcomes like this one. And these bars represent the difference between children who receive early education and care and those who do not by family income. And the point is, children from low-income family will remain at home or have much higher rates of low school readiness. Not being ready for school is an enjeu. It's a challenge. Thank you, because it means that children are not ready to learn socially, physically, emotionally, cognitively. Early childcare and education can reduce this difference to non-significance. It doesn't make such a huge difference for children from well-off families, but for children from low-income families, it does. Same thing for, this is the work of 𝗚𝗿𝗍𝗍, who's here, and the previous slide also. The difference between children who do not speak French at home and who need to go to school in French is huge when they get to school if they don't go to childcare. But if they go to childcare, they are ready for school, even though they grow up in a family environment where they are exposed to another language than French. So for integration of our new Canadian Quebecers into Quebec life and being ready for school, this is a very good policy. Very good policy. Okay, so we'll let Henrik do the next part. Yeah.
Wait, once again, it's not as plugged.
Okay, so while I get help to set up my presentation, I want to thank Silvana for organizing this and the Dean for hosting this event. I apologize for not speaking French, which is the reason why this is a bilingual event. Anyhow, it works. Awesome, thank you. So I'll continue with a little bit more kind of in-depth details about what early education looks like in Norway and research we have done on the effects of early education in Norway. But first to give you kind of some background, because Norway is a pretty small country, we're 5.5 million people. And for childcare, as I briefly get back to it, it's important that it's organized in 15 counties, similar to provinces in a sense here, with 400 municipalities, which are fairly small, mostly structural organizational entities in Norway. We have a pretty high GDP per capita, one of the richest in the world, and fairly low income inequality in Norway, but we have a fairly high wealth inequality, one of the highest in the OECD. We also have a child poverty rate which has been rising steadily for the last 15 years, and currently with UNICEF statistics reached 12%. It has been decreasing slightly. And slightly lower proportion of kids living in low-income families than in Canada. But as you probably know, we have an oil-driven economy, even though we save most of the money. We build some nice opera houses and others spend the money for pleasure. And just as you do here in Canada, we have some nice mountains and good skiing as well. So it's a diverse country, but in many ways very similar to what you have here in Canada. What's important, though, is that we have really invested money in early education. And as you can see here, back in 2013, as a fraction of our state budget or total government spending, early education exceeded the military, right? It's much because of the promise from your neighbor down south in helping us if something happened. And it has increased the military spending quite considerably to 2023, exceeding early education, but still in real term increase in early education spending has been 16% over the time period. So the increase in military spending has not been at the expense of early education. Just to give you kind of a lowdown of what early education policies look like in Norway. So we have a full year of parental leave, which is divided between mothers and fathers, which is paid. We have, as Silvana mentioned, a universal access early education system. And that means every child from approximately August, when they turn 1, they have a right to a slot in the center. Okay, so it's a right to have a slot in a childcare center in Norway. And that remains until they start school, the year they turn 6. As you've seen, it's highly subsidized. What's important is that early education in Norway is an educational enterprise by law. So back in the early 2000s, early education was moved from the Ministry of Family Affairs to the Ministry of Education. It's governed by the same ministry which governs compulsory school education and universities. So it's an integrated part of the education system in Norway from age 1, but it's voluntary. So parents can decide whether to send their kids to early education, but it's an educational enterprise, which is reflected in what's called a framework plan or a national curriculum, which I will briefly get back to. But there are general guidelines that all centers in Norway are supposed to comply with on the pedagogical content and also the values underlying the pedagogical content of early education. 𝗀𝗏𝗻 mentioned the regulated child-staff ratio, and it typically works that the way that you have in a classroom of, say, 1 to 2 year olds, you will have 1 teacher, you will have 2 assistants. So the teacher will have a tertiary degree equivalent to a bachelor's degree, and you have 2 assistants who probably, or in most cases, have a secondary degree in early childhood education or education and youth work per 9 kids. So 1 teacher, 2 assistants, which makes this a really neat ratio, 1 to 3 for the youngest ones. I think one important thing which I will also return to is the what's often called the Nordic early education philosophy. And I have, over the 15 years I worked with early education in Norway, come to love this idea of treasuring the value of childhood in itself. And I'll get back to more details about it, but the basic idea is that in the framework plan, so these are one of the first sentences in the curriculum that everyone are supposed to follow in Norway. Early education values must be communicated and practiced through its educational work. And childhood is inherently valuable, and a holistic approach to development is essential. So this kind of ripples through everything that's happening in an early childcare center in Norway from age 1 through age 5, where kids are encouraged to develop curiosity. It's very play-based, relatively little direct teaching is basically unheard of, but teacher-facilitated learning through play is the main pedagogical tool. And this framework plan has a number of different chapters, but they include the development of understanding democracy, environment, creativity, math, literacy, or not literacy, but language development. So it covers very broadly and a very holistic approach to child development. Those of you who are curious about learning more about what Norwegian centers look like can look up this piece in the 𝗥𝗏𝗃𝗃 report. I assume many of you, at least in education, are familiar with that publication in the US, which is a profile of the Nordic early education system. 𝗀𝗏𝗻 mentioned the coverage rate, but this has increased. So when we talk about coverage rate in Norway, it's a... Okay. So back in the 80s, we have had a gradual increase. So the green one here is for 1 to 2 year olds, is the coverage by year from 1980 to 2018, and from 0% to 100% of the proportion of kids in that age group in Norway. And for 1 and 2 year olds, it was kind of very uncommon until about the 2000s, when we had a pretty strong increase from about 40% to more than 80%. For the older age group, so the blue one are 3 to 5 year olds, it's been a much more gradual increase, which has actually dates back to the mid-70s. And I'll mention one thing here which says the 𝗖𝗍 agreement. Does this work? The 𝗖𝗍 agreement from 2003, which is important because what happened then was that all parties in our parliament, we have a multi-party system with usually 9 or 10 different political parties in the parliament, they all agreed on the basic premises for the development of early education in Norway, which included increasing the proportion of 1 and 2 year olds having access to early education. It included the private-public partnership, where private and public centers are treated equal. And it included the right striving towards a right for a slot in early education from age 1, which was first became legal in 2009, but the funny thing in Norway is that they tend to make legal what has been common practice for many years. So from that, I'll spend This was unreliable. This works. Okay. So I'll spend the rest of my time just showing you some of the research we've done on early education in Norway and show you why I believe it's a good investment for kids. As 𝗲𝗏 said, I'm not an early education advocate. I am an advocate for making a society as full of opportunities as possible for kids. And I found early education to be a really interesting part of that. So first, I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I know that there are many health professionals here. Our first rule is to make no harm. And we know that from way back, there have been serious concerns about consequences of having very young kids in care. The cartoon there is from a Texas newspaper, actually, back from the early 2000s. The boy pulling the girl's hair saying, "It's not my fault, I'm a product of daycare." And these concerns, they live on. In Norway, we have a cyclic, by year, a cyclic concern which increases in August and then starts to taper off in November, where someone in the newspaper are super worried about what happens to one-year-olds in childcare. And this very Norwegian-looking lady there, she's a psychoanalyst with a regular column in one of our biggest newspapers, very concerned last week that one-year-olds are in childcare. I told her that it's really great to also look at the data, which I'm going to show you, and she hasn't responded. Okay, so we have been doing a lot of work. I come from attachment research initiative, that's where I did my doctorate, and was trained in thinking that early separations are very harmful. So when I kind of started to move into this more public policy world, I was curious. So we have, and when we do research on early education in Norway, we are very concerned with the fact that kids are not randomized into childcare. So everything we do is try to make methodological tweaks where we mimic experiments in what we do. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that. But we know in Norway that age of entry into early education is not related to behavior problems up to age 8. That's a paper currently under review. We know that it's not related to parenting behavior. And we know that hours spent per week in early education is not causing behavior problems. These are papers we published. And then I'll show you a little bit more in detail to share how we do this. A study we did a couple of years ago on effects of age of entry on aggression. And we used a longitudinal data set with 1,150 something kids, which were born in the mid-2000s. But we had very detailed data on age of entry because the parents were called every other month asking, have your kids started in childcare? And then we had teacher and parent ratings of levels of physical aggression with a really nice kind of frequency-based aggression measure. But then the neat thing was that because the way uptake starts, I said earlier that you have the right to a slot from age August the year you turn 1, means that the closer in age the kids are to being born in August, the more likely they are to start at 12 months. So can I get this to work? Yeah. Okay, so the way it happens, it's pretty small here, but here is the age of entry in months, 20 months, 16 months, 10 months. Here are birth months, so from January through December. The dots here are the median entry age. And for each month, kids are born closer to the main uptake by the end of August. Right? You have a main uptake in the end of August because that's when the oldest kids, they move off to school. You free up slots, everyone move kind of up the system. So the young ones start there. So if you were born in May, then you were on average 17, or the median starting age of kids born in April was 17 months approximately. when we get to the kids born in August, they tended to be to start around their birthday. And the neat thing about this, because we found out that age of entry was not related to, birth month was not related to anything we could figure out. So it seemed pretty random when parents had their kids. We could use this as an experiment to test the effects of age of entry, accounting for all unobserved stuff. So we kind of had a natural experiment. And what we found there was that, it's so hard to explain this at a distance. We estimated the treatment effects of entering early into care for levels of aggression at age 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And in this graph, we compared the aggression levels of the kids who entered very early, so about 11 months, that's super early, 1 standard deviation earlier than the rest, and the ones who started 1 standard deviation after the mean. So these are kind of 2 slightly extreme groups. And what we found was that there were slightly higher levels of physical aggression. So these are questions about frequency of biting, hitting, kicking, etc. At age 2 for the ones who started the earliest. At age 3, there were no differences between those 2 groups, the ones who started early, the ones who started late, and 4 years it was totally gone. So there was an initial spike of higher frequencies of physical aggression among the kids entering the earliest, but it faded out soon. And it's quite small. We also did a paper where we compared data from Canada, from Norway, from the US, and Germany, estimating effects of spending many hours in care. So Silvana was part of this paper, a lot of other colleagues. And what the plot basically shows is that across countries, across age groups and different types of samples from all of these different countries, we were unable to detect harmful effects of spending full day in center care. So I love this. This was after one of my papers. Breaking news, daycare will not turn your child into a psychopath. Okay, there is also turned out to be some upsides in Norway. And the ambitions, the policy ambitions, which you can't read because they're in Norwegian, are, in this case, back from 2006. That basically, the stories Silvana told you have been the policy refrain in Norway. So we have, through multiple papers, shown positive effects in pretty strong and quasi-experimental research designs. And we know that entering early, before age 18 months in Norway, have positive effects on language skills when kids are age 3, and language skills in math when kids are 6 to 8, but they're concentrated, and I think that left out of the slide. It's concentrated among kids from the families where the parents have the fewest years of education or make the least money. And I'll make this point clear in a second. We also have a couple of colleagues, economists, have followed long-term effects into early adulthood of the expansion of early education in Norway for 3 to 6-year-olds back in the 70s. And they find long-term effects all the way up to age 30 on income, on educational attainment, school dropout, etc. And we're currently working on expanding this into the 40s, where it looks like it holds up. So these are lifelong benefits, especially for men in our follow-up of the scale-up in Norway. Okay, so I'll share one thing. Do I have 3 more minutes? 3 more minutes? This works? No? This works? Yeah. Okay, so what's nice is that when we had this scale up in Norway, where particularly for the 1 and 2-year-olds, early education expanded dramatically from about 2000 to 2010. Huge increase in slots. We had a coincidence, a complete coincidence of a big national health survey being rolled out in the same period. And this was a nice gold mine for some of us, because it allowed, again, this type of quasi-experimental test where we can almost make an experiment out of the effects of early education. And this is because the expansion varied a lot between municipalities. So this is the coverage increased on average in the population nationally, but some municipalities were super efficient in executing the policies. Others were not. Well, others were not, some were super efficient. So we had very different growth rates, and because it was really hard to execute the rollouts, there were lots of random variation in which municipalities expanded well, which allowed us again to do an experiment. So in this study, we used this health survey where we had information on when the kids attended, whether kids attended early education at 18 months, but we were able to link it to national test scores at age 10 in math and reading. These are standardized national test scores, really great test scores. And the short story is that what we find is very positive treatment effects. The blue ones are the bars of test scores for kids of parents with 9, 11, 12, 16, 18 plus years of education. And for the red ones are test scores for the ones who did not attend as a function of the policy rollout. And the take-home message here is that the expansion of early education in Norway in this time period closed the achievement gap. The achievement gap between the kids from the parents with the most years of education compared to the ones with the fewest years of education, it closed the gap by 50%. So it's not trivial. So I think it's fair to say, based on the research I've reviewed, that early education in Norway doesn't do harm, and it does seem to do good for at least the ones who are least privileged in Norway. And what we may enter a little bit into is kind of the question of why. Why does what's happening in early education where kids are 1 year old reflect on their math test scores when they're 10 years old, and even we're about to replicate this up to age 15. Long-term effects. They don't fade out like many of these intervention studies tend to do in the United States. Why? I can only speculate, but I'm increasingly curious as to whether the idea of a very developmentally appropriate approach to early education pedagogy is part of the answer. 3-year-olds, in that 𝗥𝗏𝗏𝗏 reporting, I'm cited for saying that Norwegian 1-year-olds, they run around in the woods eating leaves and hugging trees, which is not entirely wrong, even though it's a caricature. And it's something about the idea of having very age-appropriate build-up of skills. A couple of colleagues, Dana McCoy at Harvard and 𝗀𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 at Northwestern, recently published a paper in American Psychologist where they compile a lot of developmental psych evidence on what they call fold skills, which are kind of the basic building blocks of learning. How do kids learn to learn? And they point to things like creativity, curiosity, rudimentary problem solving, collaboration, executive function, of course. Still a theory without much good evidence, but I'm wondering whether the environment that kids enter into, which is intended to be supportive, holistic, child-oriented, is part of the reason why we find sustained effects of early education in Norway and many don't. If you distribute the slides, they're there. I'm almost at time. Am I? Good. Okay, thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Henrik. Et maintenant, on accueille Marie-France Reynaud, docteur Marie-France Reynaud, qui va faire la discussion de... Marie-France a écrit un livre. She wrote an entire book on the issue, Le bon sens à la Scandinave, Common Sense, the Scandinavian Way. And we should sit, yeah. And so she is, of course, and also an anecdote, because she won't tell you. She went to Norway and she did she traveled with the La Poste, le bateau de la Poste. And so she traveled all the way up north to all the little villages to witness how children are educated in Norway. So, merci Marie-France d'accepter l'invitation.
OK. Je remercie beaucoup les organisateurs pour l'invitation. C'est vraiment un plaisir là, de discuter des pays scandinaves avec des gens qui s'intéressent à leur réalisation. Je voudrais féliciter particulièrement Silvana d'avoir choisi de faire des comparaisons et de nous avoir amené Henrik. C'est sûr qu'il y a beaucoup d'avenir pour des comparaisons et son genre de programme de recherche rejoint complètement nos préoccupations et nous permet de répondre à des questions assez fines. Je vais faire mes commentaires en français, but Henrik has heard all that I have to say, so, and I think he agrees, so we've shared reflections before. Alors, pourquoi la Norvège, c'est un bon choix de la part de Silvana pour les comparaisons? La Norvège, c'est un petit pays. Et comme petit pays, ça partage des valeurs avec nous. Ça partage aussi une façon de se voir, de ses propres capacités qui nous rejoignent davantage. Il y a des valeurs communes entre la Norvège et nous, qui ont de l'importance pour le choix de l'éducation préscolaire en petite enfance, notamment l'équité des genres. Je pense qu'au Québec, on peut dire on partage vraiment ça avec les pays scandinaves, la notion que les femmes doivent pouvoir aller travailler, doivent pouvoir se réaliser et que rester à la maison, c'est pas nécessairement l'option qui est privilégiée par tout le monde. Depuis des décennies, j'essaie de parler de politiques qui sont implantées dans les pays scandinaves et que je pense qu'on peut très réalistement implanter ici. Quand je parle de la Norvège, il y a toujours quelqu'un qui vient dire « Ah oui, mais la Norvège, ils sont riches et puis ils ont du pétrole, donc on ne peut pas se comparer, on ne peut pas faire la même chose. » Alors, je voudrais débâtir cet argument-là. C'est vrai que la Norvège est plus riche que nous, mais c'est un modèle qui est partagé par d'autres pays scandinaves qui ont, notamment la Suède, là, des revenus qui sont assez semblables aux nôtres. Donc, on ne peut pas expliquer ça par leur richesse nécessairement. Par ailleurs, leur pétrole, ils s'en servent pas pour financer leur politique sociale maintenant, mais pour assurer une durabilité de leur politique sociale dans le temps. Quand il n'y aura plus de pétrole, il y aura de l'argent de côté pour continuer d'implanter le modèle. Donc, ils utilisent une très petite partie, autour de 3%, en fait, les intérêts pour financer leurs infrastructures. Donc, on ne peut pas dire ce qu'ils font en Scandinavie, puis en Norvège, les investissements que Silvana et Henrik ont montrés sont redevables à leur... au fait qu'ils ont du pétrole. Remarquez que nous aussi, on a du pétrole, on n'a pas la même façon de gérer. Donc, on peut se comparer. La Norvège est un pays où il y a beaucoup de données pour la comparaison. Silvana travaille très fort avec son observatoire aussi, puis l'Institut de la statistique pour rendre des données disponibles ici. Et donc, on est capable de se comparer sur beaucoup d'enjeux. Heureusement ou malheureusement, je ne ferai pas de politique ici, le Québec n'est pas un pays Alors, quand vous êtes comme moi, tout le temps scotché sur les études de l'OCDE, ben c'est le Canada qui apparaît, c'est pas le Québec, donc ça demande toujours de faire des ajustements. Et particulièrement pour la petite enfance, le Québec a quand même démontré des politiques plus favorables plus précocement que le reste du Canada. Donc, c'est intéressant de faire une comparaison directement avec le Québec, ce que 𝗲𝗏 peut faire, parce que ce que l'OCDE fait, ça nous donne une indication qui est un peu qu'on doit mitiger. Il y a des politiques publiques, vous allez voir, puis Henrik, could you say a word about opting out, opting in? I think it's very interesting, the kind of policy we can import.
Yeah, does this work? So, probably as is the case here in Norway, when your kid approaches 1 and you want your kid in early education, you apply. So you go on the web, you fill out the long form. If you have low income, you can document this through sending in a copy of your tax form, which will produce reduced price. At the same time, we have had a fairly considerable and still have an underuse by children from families with little money, where parents have few years of education, or where parents have their origins far from Norway. I've been advocating testing out a system which is equivalent to how kids in Norway are assigned to school. Because the spring, when your kid turns 6, you get a letter saying that you're supposed to meet up at this school at that day, at that time. Right? That's how it works in Norway. And then there are some transition practices from early education. But you're not given a choice in Norway. You show up at school. Why don't we do the same for early education? It's voluntary. So if you get a text message when your kid is 9 months old, in a language you understand, saying that we have a slot for you starting on August 20th in this childcare center. Do you want to have that slot? Do you want to apply for a different center, or would you rather wait? This is easy to do administratively because when kids are born, they are in the medical birth registry. They're part of our population statistics. So is the parent's income, because we have the income registry. Every tax information for everyone in Norway is in that registry. So parents don't need to apply. We know that 30% of those eligible for reduced payment don't apply. And I was part of a government expert group advice, so we submitted a report a year and a half ago, never mind, advising the government on how to reduce consequences of child poverty. One of our many suggestions about early education, based on the research I showed you and other research in Norway, was to reduce barriers to entering early education by applying this opt-out system as opposed to the opt-in system. And currently they are running trials in 4 municipalities in Norway, testing that out. So I'm really excited about that. Whether it works, we don't know. There is a recent paper from Germany where it seemed to work pretty well for older kids, and I'll keep you posted on what we find.
Alors, c'est le genre de politique intéressante qu'on peut regarder aller, s'en inspirer, comparer. Au-delà des politiques, moi, je trouve que les pays scandinaves, la Norvège, en fait une belle démonstration, une expérience d'encadrement du privé qu'on n'a pas ici au Québec. Puis là, je le vois ces temps-ci, pour l'autre partie de ma vie qui se passe dans les services de santé, on n'a vraiment pas d'habitude d'encadrer correctement. On laisse aller le privé. Et là, on a beaucoup à apprendre. C'est possible d'avoir un système privé en parallèle qui répond aux mêmes normes, qui fonctionne bien, puis qu'on paye autant, mais pas plus cher. C'est pas ce qu'on a actuellement. Donc, ça, il faudra aller voir comment c'est fait, quels sont leurs trucs particuliers. Ce que j'aime de la Norvège aussi, c'est qu'elle a des régions éloignées, là. Je suis allée voir des garderies au nord du cercle polaire, et puis c'est assez impressionnant, donc on a des choses à apprendre. Ils ont des populations autochtones, il y a des particularités pour les populations autochtones qu'il faut prendre en compte, et ça, c'est possible avec cette comparaison-là. Et puis, on est tous là dans le même bateau actuellement. On a un environnement sociopolitique externe à nos pays comparable. Henrik a montré que les investissements là, dans les dépenses militaires ont augmenté, puis vont probablement augmenter encore là, si ce qu'ils nous disent à 𝗚𝗿𝗵𝗍𝗍 est vrai, là, que les pays d'Europe augmentent leurs investissements. Et il y a moyen de le faire, et je prévois déjà l'argument qu'on va mettre plus d'argent dans le militaire et que donc on ne peut pas investir dans nos politiques sociales. Il y a moyen de le faire, ils l'ont fait, ils ont augmenté. Et ils ont quand même maintenu les investissements, sinon augmenté leurs investissements là, dans le childcare. J'aime beaucoup le programme de recherche de Henrik aussi, parce que de montrer que la garderie ne nuit pas. Quand on est dans le domaine, on prend ça pour acquis, que tout le monde trouve que c'est extraordinaire. Et puis nous, on a mis nos enfants dans les CPE ou dans mon temps, c'était les programmes PIL, là. Mais c'était à peu près l'équivalent. Et on pense que tout le monde est convaincu de ça, mais on voit ces temps-ci, mondialement, un retour de valeurs plus traditionnelles. La tradwife est un peu prônée dans plusieurs... puis pour nos jeunes aussi, il y en a beaucoup qui voient ce genre de publicité-là. Alors, je trouve que ce genre de recherche-là qui réitère que ça ne nuit pas, non seulement ça ne nuit pas, mais que ça fait du bien, c'est vraiment important. Dans les comparaisons, il faut quand même aller dans le détail parce qu'on ne met pas toujours les mêmes mots pour les mêmes choses. Alors, si on regarde le private-public, là, on avait une discussion tout à l'heure. Dans le fond, il y a 25% de ce qui est vraiment privé pour du profit en Norvège, même si on voit 50%, parce qu'il y a une autre moitié du private qui est du non-profit. Et on pourrait discuter là, si nos CPE sont des non-profit ou vraiment du public. Mais donc, ça mérite une attention particulière par des chercheurs qui connaissent bien le milieu. J'ai discuté avec Henrik de ce qui était le leverage over admissions là, que vous avez vu dans sa diapositive sur le privé. Alors, je me demandais si c'était des garderies confessionnelles ou... il semblerait qu'en Norvège, c'est pas le même portrait qu'ici, mais ça, il faut aller regarder qu'est-ce qui fait que les gens vont aller dans une garderie plutôt qu'une autre. Est-ce que c'est en Suisse, quand j'étais là, vraiment, les écoles privées étaient beaucoup confessionnelles par rapport à l'école publique. Alors, c'est des choses qu'il faut regarder en particulier. Alors, c'est quoi les messages? Puis je veux pas prendre plus de temps parce que je suis certaine que vous avez plein de questions pour nos intéressants conférenciers. Le message, c'est qu'on commence à investir trop tard, qu'il faudrait investir vraiment plus tôt, que la science nous dit depuis longtemps, mais là, il faudrait l'écouter, que le cerveau se développe beaucoup dans les premiers mois, dans les premières années, que c'est le temps d'investir. Bon, on a eu une discussion sur Eichmann, le return on investment. Henrik pense que Eichmann crée trop d'attentes, mais de toute façon, avec la diapositive qui montre qu'on commence à investir trop tard, puis qu'on pourrait juste déplacer vers la gauche, plus tôt ces investissements-là, à tout le moins, on aurait des résultats équivalents. Bon, la formation, c'est une chose qu'il faut retenir, le fait qu'on peut demander ça. C'est une société capable de demander une formation de niveau baccalauréat puis de payer les éducateurs en garderie. Ici, c'est autant que les gardiens de zoo, mais là, c'est presque autant que les enseignants à l'école. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on fait en partant d'ici? Bien, on les encourage à continuer leur comparaison. Et puis, on véhicule l'idée que c'est pas parce que c'est du privé que ça doit être de mauvaise qualité, mais qu'il faut l'encadrer, le privé, avec des normes et un financement adéquat, que ça, il y a des pays qui réussissent à le faire, donc nous, on pourrait le vouloir. Il faut peut-être qu'on continue. Je pense que l'équité de genre au Québec, on a fait des gros progrès là-dessus. La valeur de l'enfant, ça, je ne suis pas convaincue que tous nos représentants sont convaincus de la grande valeur de l'enfant préscolaire, parce que ça apparaît pas beaucoup dans les discussions politiques. Ça ne sera jamais la question de l'urne, mais on aimerait ça que ça apparaisse quelquefois, ça apparaît pas souvent. Alors ça finit sur le fait que nous, en santé publique, on parle de prévention. On ne se fait pas tout le temps écouter, mais il faut vraiment continuer de le faire parce que dans le domaine de l'éducation préscolaire, comme dans le domaine de la santé ou d'autres, mieux vaut prévenir que guérir, puis ça, c'est pas moi qui l'ai dit. Merci. On s'attend à ce que je m'assoie là-dessus.
Oui, donc c'est le moment de poser vos questions. It's time to ask for your questions.
We'll translate.
Oui, you can speak in French or English. Anything about the comparison, the research, the potential for reduction of inequalities? I know I let you think about your questions. I know we have people in the room who are pediatricians, people in public health, policymakers, economists, child developmentalists, child educators. So please be free to ask your question with your own perspective. Amélie?
Thank you for the presentations, very interesting. Is it possible to compare on quality of the programs? So you talked a bit about ratios, so we know that ratios are slightly better than they are here. And you talked a bit about the curriculum. Is it like a universal curriculum across all childcare centers in Norway? Okay, so would it be possible, you think, to compare the quality of those curriculum across country? Because it's one thing to just like improve access and like make more slots, but if those slots aren't of good quality, then the results won't be there.
Do you have ECHR's data?
Yes, we do. I mean, very wise people disagree with me on the value of observed quality measures in early education. But my perspective is that making direct comparisons of quality with established international type quality measures like CLAS or ECHRS is probably not going to help us. First of all, they tend not to be very predictive of child outcomes. And the causal evidence is very weak. I have a paper on, very soon, working paper where we find class effects in Dutch data, causal class effects in the short term. But I think that if we were to compare systems and see kind of what could one country learn from another country, I think a combination of structural quality and more qualitative text-focused considerations of things like curriculum tests or texts is much more useful than a high Ecker score in Norway. They are, by the way, not very high. Having said that, the data we have. And it's not predictive of child outcomes in Norway, as in so many other contexts, even when we account for the fact that the richer kids on average have slightly higher quality. So not even with the selection effects, we don't see that. So I think that's part of it. Of course, scaling up bad early education is a very bad idea. And we have data from the US, from other countries in Europe, and also from Quebec showing that that can be true. But I would rather go at a holistic approach to comparing system level, curriculum level, and structural level, rather than quality measures. Long answer for a short question, sorry.
Oui.
Thanks. Thank you, first of all, for putting it together. It was so interesting, learned a lot. So thanks for the presentations. Few questions and a comment. So the first question is somewhat related to the quality. I'm confused. Public, private. I think what you're talking about from what you said is something very different from, you mentioned also for-profit, non-for-profit. I think that in Quebec, there is a, if I understand it correctly, there is a section, a fairly considerable number of daycares or childcare centers that are private and for-profit, and therefore I would assume that the quality, the number of educators, assistants, etc., would be affected by, of course, the market in that sense. Now, when you said private, you also said, and it's fully paid for by the government. So why do you call it private? And what's the difference between private and public in Norway?
Thank you. The quick answer is, among the 50% of centers in Norway that are privately owned, half of them are owned by for-profit companies that take out dividends, half of them are owned by NGOs. And the NGOs don't take out money. They just run this to have a job and to have, because many of the NGOs have an ideology about good early education.
But then there is still...
But the ones that make money, they make money from rent. Right, so a lot is regulated as an early education center lot, so you can't use it to build a factory or a gas station. They own the buildings, and then they extract rent from that, which is part of the running budget. The private for-profit centers, they have a slightly, they are pushing the limits of the child-staff ratio, but they can't push it much because it's regulated. So I think what the take-home from the Norwegian system is that it's not the private, it's not the ownership type which is the key, it's how you regulate the owners and what they are supposed to do. Because there are many reasons to think that private owners might have smarter, more efficient way of doing stuff than public companies. That happens, not always, but it might be. And that's the ideology that went into this kind of childcare agreement, that private is a good comparison because you create competition. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's the idea. But it's regulated so they can't cheat.
Okay, thanks. And to comment, if I may, I really like you asking the question, what is it, why is it that there is that long-lasting effect of being in early childhood education? And at a psychological level, I would agree with you, and as Silvana knows, we are funded to try to answer that question at a brain level, when our hypothesis simply is that you are facilitating the growth of the brain, not only physically, but of course we were hearing about synapses, dendrites, etc. And so having the child in this relatively rich, holistic environment must be changing the brain, and it must be changing it for the better so that it increases its capacity to deal with everything that comes later. So, and we have a mobile MRI that will be driving around Montreal and hopefully answering a question of this sort.
Wonderful. And then I think the more observational approach to that is to think that brain growth in early education is supported to the extent that the counterfactual environment is less good, right? And which is probably the reason why we see no positive effect whatsoever of kids, of parents with much money and many years of education, because the counterfactual is at least as good. But it's the other kids whose counterfactual is not as great, where with what you measure is what we hypothesize is happening. Yeah.
Oui, je voulais dire que 𝗚𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 a fait un programme là, sur l'évaluation de la qualité, puis qu'elle conduit depuis plusieurs années. Puis un des éléments de la qualité, c'est la formation des éducatrices. Et ça, c'est facile à comparer entre les deux pays. Pour ce qui est du curriculum, je ne peux pas parler pour la Norvège, mais j'avais vu pour la Suède comment c'était pas un gros document, le curriculum, versus ce qu'on pouvait avoir au Québec. Et j'avais discuté de ça, puis on m'avait répondu que quand les gens ont un diplôme universitaire, ils sont capables de savoir quoi faire et on n'a pas besoin de leur prescrire dans un énorme document tout ce qui... Alors ça, c'est pour ça que comparer l'épaisseur des documents, ça ne nous donnerait pas grand-chose, mais le fait qu'il y ait une formation, qu'on soit plus exigeant en termes de ratio d'éducatrices formées à l'université ou l'équivalent, est un élément de la qualité qu'on peut voir tout de suite.
Oui, and I would add the selection of people going into the profession when higher education is required is different also. Carol.
Thank you for your insights. With such level of access, with such ratio, I would anticipate that you could have an issue of workforce also to provide the quantity, the sufficient workforce of qualified workforce. And also, such qualified workforce is in competition with other levels, with other sectors. How do you deal with the issue? In Quebec, even though we don't have this qualified workforce, we have regularly issues of shortages. How do you deal with that?
Well, they're not good at it, and it's a real problem. So we have, this year, there were 40% non-occupied slots in the early education programs in our university colleges. So there were 40% of the slots that just weren't there. The students weren't there. It's not an attractive career in Norway. We have 30% of our centers lack early education teachers, but have teachers or other with similar types of education, but not early educators, who are working there instead. And a little bit less than 10% lack teachers to meet the standards. I think the answer is super simple, but it's very expensive. If you pay people more, they go there. And Norway doesn't have a good strategy for this. We have a bunch of strategies that hasn't failed in trying to promote this as a super good career opportunity, which if you like kids and you like pedagogical work, it is, but it's hard and not super well paid. So we don't have the solution, but we share the problem.
I'll ask the question in English, but I could in French, but you'll answer in English. What is the variation of, I'm going to say quality for lack of a better word, but it's not necessarily using the 𝗥𝗏𝗴s or the class, but the actual care offered. Because I would say there's a big variation in quality in Quebec, huge, even in infrastructure and in ratios and in education. Is there much of a variation? And is it based on SES? You mentioned municipalities are more or less successful. Is that the variation? Speak to that issue. I talk about buildings and teachers, everything.
Yeah, well, there is little variation in the structural quality features which are regulated. Teacher education, I mentioned kind of lack of teachers, child-staff ratio, square meters indoor, outdoor, some of those things. From what we know, there is considerable variation. And that's in when colleagues try to estimate value-added scores. So they basically try to see holistically what do kids learn? How do they develop? We know that there is variation. We don't know exactly the sources of it. We have anecdotal evidence that it might be tied to socio-demographic compositions, particularly in the bigger cities like Oslo, where we have enormous within city differences in socioeconomic conditions. But we don't have systematic data on that yet.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Just for context, I'm a pediatrician and researcher that's based in British Columbia, so a slightly different context. But one thing that really struck me about the presentation, and Henrik, that you mentioned, was the amount of relative of GDP that's invested into early childhood education and care in Norway. And you also made a comment about there being this sort of like intangible value of childhood in the Norwegian political system and social system generally. And one thing I think that we deal with a lot here is, I think, ongoing underinvestment in childhood by our policymakers. Children don't work and children don't vote, and so they're very infrequently seem to be at the center of many policy decisions. And certainly in my current context, if anything, we're having market cutbacks to everything involving children. So I guess my question is partly like, was this recognition of children and their importance something that is just like sort of an intrinsic, intangible Norwegian or Scandinavian value? Or was this something that was a concerted effort over years for scholars and advocates to kind of infiltrate the policy system to make that happen?
I believe it's, to some extent, the first. So it's something intrinsic. And the reason we're saying that is if you go back and look at the very early legislation after World War II, it was child welfare legislation. Child well-being, play, it's part of the legislation, the mandate for the very, very few, but still then existing early education centers. And it has remained a basic tenet of the legislative text ever since. The priority, at least from the mid-70s, was first the interest of the parents. So the idea was to give women the opportunity to work. Then it was the interest of children. Then it was the society as a whole in the prioritized list in the legal text. I think you kind of strike to a bigger point, because at least since 2003, when there was this legal agreement in the parliament, or agreement on a legal text, there is a charming consistency in the thinking about early education across the political spectrum. So I've been meeting with all ministries of education in Norway since 2010, except one dude who was there for 2 months. And that's been socialists, it's been the Labour Party, it's been the Social Liberal Party, it's been the Conservative Party, multiple from each of those. And they all think the same. They all want the same policies. They don't differ in any of this, but they compete in going for elections with promising to cap the parental fee further. So it's something about, at school, for school policy, there are enormous political divides. But for early education, it's not. And I believe what has happened, this is my personal theory, that over the years, since World War II, and going even further back to the late 1800s with 𝗱𝗡𝗶𝗿's ideas of education entering into the Norwegian education system, the idea of public early education as a basic good in society, like public healthcare, like elderly care, it's something you cannot dare to remove as a politician, regardless of whether you're populist right or populist left or anywhere in between, because it's conceived to be such a basic part of society. It has taken probably then at least 8 years to get there, but they don't touch it.
I had to pick the question that I would ask you because I have so many questions. Here in Quebec, we measure the readiness of kids once they get into school at 5, and we know that there's a lot of them that are vulnerable in their development. Do you see that? Is there such a measure in Norway?
One of the parts of the Nordic pedagogical philosophy I'm not so happy with is the extreme opposition to testing. Even screening kids for developmental delays is highly politically debatable. So it doesn't even reach the political level because it's just killed before it gets there, which means that first formal testing we have in Norway is fifth grade, age 10. And then there is an enormous trust in the ability of early education teachers and teachers in school to identify the vulnerable kids. Our data says that they don't.
Well, I think that we've made the opposite mistake. We evaluate too much the kids and we do not give them proper early education. So
there is a nice middle ground, don't you think so?
Merci beaucoup. So it's already. Oui.
In Norway, you have the same phenomenon. In my nuclear family, we're 8 adults for 1 grade child. When I was a kid, there was 1 adult for 1.4 kid. That means there are more adults in the nuclear family than kids. That means their brain development must be different. You understand what I'm saying? Matter of fact, at Christmas, there's only 1 grandchild for 8 adults.
The birth rate,
back then,
right?
There were 1 adult for 1.4
yep.
kids.
Birth rates are declining in Norway as well.
Yeah, in Quebec also. Very much. Merci beaucoup à tous. Merci pour vos questions, votre attention. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. And we have some petits fours if you want to grab some. Thank you so much for coming. Et puis, à bientôt. C'est